you really can't tell the meaning of someone's life till the very end. And it's for the same reason, right, is that how all the pieces fit together in the story or in the life is not necessarily determined until the final moment. And I think that's part of the reason too why among Catholics, for example, and Christians in general, there's an idea that salvation can always be attained, right up to the last moment, no matter what your life was like. And you think, well, that's a pretty cheap trick, because you can run around doing terrible things your whole life, but as long as you get it together the last second, then you're scot-free. But if you think about it in terms of a story, then you can understand how that could conceivably be the case. And it's for this reason, of course, that this lecture in particular makes me nervous more than any of the other ones I do, because I've been telling you a story that's basically 40 hours long, right, in its spoken form, and then who knows how long in its written form, and it's complicated to pull it together properly, and that's partly because, as far as I've been concerned, we've been talking about issues in psychology that are more difficult than any other. First of all, conceptually, even from a neuropsychological perspective, because I've been offering you a model of the way the brain processes the environment that I think is really novel, and I think it reflects the current state of neuroscience. But more than that, there's the problem that we've been dealing with issues all the way along of life and death, and of war and destruction, and of the possibility for clear-headed optimism, right? A possibility which, as we've discussed, more or less escaped Tolstoy, say, for most of his life, right? Because when Tolstoy woke up from his delusions, he looked at the world and he said, well, clearly it's such a terrible place that, as if you're not looking at it through the veils of illusion, there's no way that you can do anything but stand in opposition to it once you understand its basic structure, right? Suffering, and innocent suffering, and complete vulnerability, and the whole existential mess that makes up life. Now, it turns out that Tolstoy overcame his rationally induced cynicism in a kind of mystical way. He had a dream that he was suspended from some transcendent space by a belt around the middle of his waist, which hung him over a pit of chaos. And in that image he found comfort, and fair enough, it's a powerful image, but it's not well delineated, right? And it worked well for Tolstoy, and you can see that the image has power, but you can't grab it with your rational mind. You can't take it into pieces and analyze it as an argument. And that's what we do if we're intellectuals, right? We try to understand the detailed structure of something. And I think the detailed structure of what Tolstoy apprehended as optimistic is actually comprehensible. And we've been working towards that and circling around it the entire course of this lecture series. But I've found with this material that with each circling around the target, it gets clearer and clearer. It's a funny thing. It's like you're looking at something that's too complicated to see all at once. So you have to look at it from multiple different perspectives, and again and again. And each time you look at it, it becomes clearer and clearer. And that's still the case for me when I go through this material. Every time I go through it, I think, oh yeah, that piece fits there, and that piece fits there, and that's how that makes sense, and oh, that's a lot more remarkable than I thought it was to begin with, and so on. And it seems fundamentally inexhaustible. And of course, that's what you'd expect from deep, deep stories, right? Stories that have been around for thousands and thousands of years wouldn't have been around for thousands and thousands of years unless they were in some sense inexhaustible. And we've talked about some of the processes that might contribute to that inexhaustibility. So at the beginning of the lecture series, I told you to consider the assumption that there was more than one way of looking at the world, right? There was the standard materialist sort of scientific viewpoint, which was that the world was made up of objects, independently existent, us among them. The objects had no intrinsic value one way or another, and the issue of meaning per se wasn't included in that account. And then I said, well, wait, there's another way of looking at the world that we spent just as much time developing, that we utilize even more, and that's the narrative. That's the narrative way of looking at the world, to consider the nature of experience rather than the nature of objects as real, to consider your experience as real, even though it includes things that can't be easily and tangibly identified, things like emotions, which of course you find compelling, sometimes even beyond your will, things like motivational states, fantasies, ideals, all the things that compel your behavior and give you some sense that there's a direction to life. And people who study emotion and perception have come to understand that the act of transforming the world into something simply made out of objects is incredibly difficult. It's so difficult that we haven't been able to design machines that can do it at all. It turns out also that when we look at the world, we're not just looking at it with our visual systems, but we're looking at it with our motor output systems and our emotions, so that when you look at something like a chair, which just stands there for you like an object, it turns out that the mechanical systems, the motor systems that you would use to use the chair, to sit on it, are activated during the act of perception. It also turns out sometimes that when you look at something, especially if it's something you don't understand and that scares you, you actually react to it, conceptualize it with your body and with your emotions before you have any idea what it is from the perspective of an object. When you look at the world and when you think about the world, you have to do it from a motivated perspective and an emotionally ridden perspective. You can't even see the world without being gripped by your motivation and emotional states. And so the idea that rationality or perception is somehow separate from or superordinate to perception and emotion is just wrong. We understand now that you can't even think without being motivated. You can't see the world without being motivated. And that means you always look at the world through a kind of lens. And the lens is a narrowing lens, and it has to be, because the world is so complicated you can't see it all at once. You're only seeing tiny slices of it in time and tiny slices of it in space. And even then you have to narrow it to only those things that are relevant to you at that moment. And we don't know exactly how you do that. We know that it takes years and years of perceptual work in infancy, say, so that you manage to build up an object conception of the world. That's probably all you're doing in the first 2 or 3 years of life. And you're doing it constantly, and it's just as complicated as learning language, say, or even more complicated. Most of it's invisible, and we don't know how children do that, and by the time they can talk, they've already done it, so they can't even tell us what they're doing. It takes a long time to build up an object world. And when you look at the world, when you go from point A to point B, even when you're doing something as simple as looking for food in the kitchen, you ignore everything about the world that isn't relevant to making yourself a peanut butter sandwich, and you focus in on those few things that are: the refrigerator, the food, the knives, the cutlery, and so on, and everything else is screened out. And you can't help but look at the world through that kind of lens. And the lenses change, and you can be in different motivational states, and they can change because of internal transformations. You're not hungry, you're thirsty, or you're not thirsty, you're interested in someone, or somebody's telling you a story, and then you adopt their motivational framework, and you can see the world through their eyes. And now we know the neural machinery for that, and we already talked about that. So we can toss back and forth these motivational frames of reference, and that gives us insight into someone else's world. You can look at the world endless numbers of ways, and what you're trying to do is, out of its infinite richness, so to speak, is to pull out parts of it that are useful for you while you're moving from point A to point B. And this can be a chair if you want to sit down, but if you want to take the light bulb out of the ceiling, then it's a stool or a table. And whether or not it's a chair or a stool or a table depends just as much on what you're doing as it does on what it is.